Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm John Fortney, the Director of Communication with the Senate Majority Caucus, the Republican Caucus in the Ohio Senate. Always great to have on the program, on the President's Podcast, of course, Ohio Senate President Rabbi McColley. And we're happy to have back on the program the President of School Choice Ohio, Rabbi Yitz. Great to see both of you. I don't know if you've had a chance to see this, if our viewers have had a chance, but this was really a remarkable editorial that was in the Wall Street Journal April 22nd, and the title of it, Ohio's School Choice Success Story, all about the EdChoice Scholarship Program, the highly controversial program that the public school teachers unions love to hate. But it definitely points to this study that basically studied 6,000 students over 6 years between 2008 and 2014 that included the original expansion, not this most recent one. But here is the opening paragraph of the editorial. New results are in on Ohio's school choice program, and they're looking good. A study by researchers at the Urban Institute found that students who used vouchers to attend private school saw substantially improved long-term academic outcomes. I guess President McColley shouldn't be that surprising, but based on the controversy and all the pushback on this program, especially during the most recent expansion, this is really a vindication and a long-term study based on a solid universe of statistics.
Yeah, I think it's a validation that the school choice programs that we have in Ohio aren't the proverbial boogeymen that people think that they are. And it really is validation in many respects that allowing parents and children to choose the best educational options for them ultimately will lead to better outcomes. And that's really what we're after with these programs.
So from what that study showed then regarding state testing was what?
Right, so that showed slightly negative results for students using an EdChoice scholarship. It seemed that they had regressed slightly academically, at least if you look at the state test results, which, again, it's a fair way to look at it. There are probably a lot of reasons why that could have been. Maybe the schools they're attending weren't very focused on that. But what it did show, and what this study continues to show as well, is that it did have a positive impact on public school performance. That public schools in the area that were starting to see students in their geographical areas starting to use EdChoice scholarships, they upped their game. And that study also shows, this study shows that as well, that there's been remarkable college enrollment rates for EdChoice scholarship students, but it also shows that the public school students that were theoretically impacted, it also seemed to improve.
Yeah, and to pick up on your point about state testing, within the findings of the study, I'll just read an excerpt. It says, state test might not be an ideal metric for evaluating private school quality, given curricular differences between sectors and different incentives to perform on state exams between public schools that faced accountability for their students' performance on these exams versus private schools that did not. I suppose at some point there needs to be some standard, but to your point, the Wall Street Journal says, opponents deride school choice programs as the enemy of public education, President McColley. The data, though, tells a different story. Before EdChoice was made universal, only persistently underperforming public schools were eligible. To capture the effect of the program on public schools, the authors compared outcomes at schools on either side of the eligibility threshold. Students who remained at EdChoice eligible public schools were 3 percentage points more likely to attend college, 6 percentage points more likely to graduate than students at ineligible public schools. Not hard to understand why, they say. When public schools face competitive pressure to retain students, their performance improves.
That's been true across the board in any segment of our society, is that when you introduce competition into any element, you're going to see better outcomes. People are going to be more likely to, as Yitz said, up their game, if you will. And that's what we're seeing over the course of a relatively long period of time, that these public schools realized, hey, to answer to the taxpayers, to keep students in our buildings, to be able to make sure that we're still going to be competitive, to keep these families making their own decisions to keep these students in the public school, we need to be better at educating these students and create better outcomes. And that's also a win that's highlighted by this study.
Yeah, the baseline here from the study itself, it says we track the college enrollment and degree attainment. So not just kids that enroll in college, but those who actually come out with results, a degree. They track 6,000 students who participated in EdChoice between '08 and 2014. So a 6-year period. So you have a really solid set of numbers to work off of. Comparing them with outcomes of more than 500,000 students with similar demographic characteristics and student achievement who remained in public schools. Basic finding here. We find that students who used an EdChoice scholarship to attend private school were substantially more likely to enroll in and graduate from college than similar students who remained in public schools. For college enrollment, the impact of EdChoice participation was 15 percentage points, which represents a 32% increase. 32% more over public school enrollment rates of 48%. For college graduation, the impact was 9 percentage points, corresponding to a 60% increase above the public school rate of 15%. Why do you think it has that much of a success story to tell for EdChoice?
I don't know 100%. I think that's one of the things that, these studies show you what the results are, but they don't necessarily always do a great job of telling you why this happened. I guess we could theorize. There are probably a lot of factors, but to me, fundamentally, when you put parents in charge, when you give students themselves a choice, they're going to own it much more, and hopefully they're going to buy in. And I think it's important, I think, for your listeners to know. I've been an advocate for school choice for a long time. I know the president's a supporter. I know the Senate majority, generally speaking, is a strong supporter of giving parents options. But I think it's important for people to understand that when we pursue school choice options through legislation, through state policy, the goal is not to pull kids out of a public school and put them into a private school. The goal is to give options to parents, and if they want to choose their public school, they can and they should. And that seems to raise the bar for everybody. And I think when people feel in charge, when the legislature, when the state gives them tools to exercise their rights, Americans seize the opportunity and succeed.
It's amazing when you see today's radical progressive left, President McColley, vilifying EdChoice and parents for daring to want to jump into this program, saying, well, it's an abuse of state tax dollars. Well, these parents pay taxes.
Yeah, the audacity of all of us for trying to give parents and kids more options. We've been pretty open. EdChoice is a pro-family policy. We're not going to shy away from it. It's not going away, despite the best efforts of many of the folks who are in the opposition effort to EdChoice programs. Many of them have made the argument that, look, these are public school dollars that should be going to the public schools, and there's no reason why they should be diverted from the public schools. Well, the truth is they were never in the public schools, and if we didn't put them into EdChoice, I can assure you, given the other record-breaking increases in funding that we've given to public schools directly, this would not have ended up in public schools if it weren't in the EdChoice line item. And so that argument is simply a fallacy, one that needs to be pushed back on. And so really, this is just even more vindication for us to continue to invest in the program, and I don't see that ending anytime soon.
And really, doesn't this save the state of Ohio? A lot of the reporting out there says $1 billion being spent on the EdChoice scholarship itself after the expansion during the current budget, as we're wrapping up the current budget. But the average per pupil spending right now, K through 12, is something like $14,215. An EdChoice scholarship.
Oh, John, those are old numbers. We're past 16 now.
We're past 16?
And that does not include capital dollars for buildings.
Sure. So yes, absolutely. $14 billion and counting in new school building construction since the DeRolf decision back in early 2001, I think that was. But the EdChoice scholarship program is available to every family, every student, based on a sliding income scale up to 450% of the poverty line. $6,100 K through 8 is available for a scholarship, $8,400 9 through 12, and then it's on that sliding income scale the more that you make. So it really is a savings to the state of Ohio, because just because we pour money into public education hasn't exactly produced results that many people would like to see, especially in the urban areas.
Exactly. And, when you look at the per pupil spending and you look at the state's investment in these school districts, oftentimes it is the poorest performing school districts in the urban areas that are getting well above the state average as far as the money goes from the state on a per pupil basis. But when you look at this option, this competition being injected into the market, not only is it a savings, but it's a good return on investment, because we're seeing better outcomes for those kids in those districts. And I would suspect that as we spread this even further across the state, we're going to continue to see more savings on the basis of how much we would put in, and also better outcomes.
It's just interesting here. According to the study, it says, for both enrollment and graduation, we find suggestive evidence that effects are largest for approximately 60% of EdChoice students who remained in the program for at least 4 years. That makes sense, doesn't it? Because as we all know, if you're moving a child from school to school to school, sometimes that happens based on whatever the parent's profession is. But if you give it a chance for a solid 4 years in a productive, disciplined environment, there's going to be results.
Yeah, and we've seen that anecdotally, in real time. The more time that you spend with a student, the more likely that they'll be able to catch up. And in many cases, especially in the urban areas, a lot of these students come in significantly behind. So it will take, that private school time to catch them up, but it seems to clearly be working.
Yeah, there's a lag. And speaking of, some of the urban areas where you have more of a minority population, here's what the study says. Estimated enrollment impacts are strongest for male students, Black students, students with below median test scores before leaving public school, and students who spent the most time in poverty during their childhood. For example, EdChoice participation increased Black students' college enrollment by 18 percentage points. That's 37%, compared with a 13 percentage point or 26% increase for white students. The EdChoice impact on college graduation was 10 percentage points for both groups, but that increase corresponds to a 136% increase for Black students compared with 79% for white students. I mean, it's a win-win in some of these metropolitan areas where students have, for whatever reason, been left behind. But President McColley, those are also the districts that are spending tens of thousands of dollars per pupil.
Absolutely. Those are the most expensive districts we have. And really, we've been throwing money into those districts with no noticeable appreciation in outcomes. And so this is not just an option that we're offering these families and these students, but it's a necessity that we continue it.
What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. But, one of the things, that always comes up, like you alluded to before, about we're spending all this money, we should spend it over there. I find it a little bit, more than a little bit disingenuous to level that kind of criticism. You mentioned $1 billion. Well, that $1 billion is being spent on 165,000 students. So it sounds like a lot of money. That's a lot of kids. The state's saving a lot of money because we're going to fund these kids no matter where they go. And also, I think that people forget the state has increased public school funding significantly, well past the rate of inflation in total, while at the same time expanding school choice options. And by the way, our public school system has declined in enrollment by well over 100,000 students in that time. So our total spend is up. Our total per pupil spend is significantly up, and we've increased options for families. That's a win-win. And the state opted to fund these students directly in a way that essentially holds districts harmless at the request of the school choice community, but also our public school friends as well, and those associations. But they never give you credit for that, so sorry.
Yeah, public schools are not writing a check to a private school for students that have transferred to the private school, correct?
No, this money never hits their accounts, and never even gets put into the pile and pot of money that's going to end up in public schools anyway. And so their argument that somehow we're stealing money from public schools is just completely false.
Yeah. And the state covers, by and large, the cost of transporting those students. So just a lot of the complaints that frankly does get repeated in the press. And I'm not like a fake news kind of guy. That's kind of your lane.
That's right.
But like reporters need to do a better job researching this stuff.
Well, it's too easy to fall into the left narrative that, Republicans hate public schools in Ohio and they're trying to put public schools out of business. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nobody believes that. I mean, if you truly want and are happy with your public school, we encourage you to stay in your public school, correct?
That's an element of the school choice argument, is that public schools are a piece of that choice argument, as are parochial schools, as are other forms of private schools, as are charter schools, as are a number of different options. It's all about choice. It's all about what's best for the family and what's best for that child. At the end of the day, when we boil it down to that, for anybody to oppose it, I think is really intellectually dishonest.
The study also says, taken together, these findings indicate that Ohio's school voucher program had the largest benefits for the primarily low-income students who used the program to attend private school, and that students who remained in public schools also saw improvements in their chances of getting to and through college. Something that you alluded to, that competition is good for everybody, but really this has benefited, as this is totally contradicts what the media narrative is, that actually wealthy families are the ones that are mainly using these scholarships. Well, the ones that are benefiting from them the most, getting the most results, are low-income families.
Inherently, the way it's set up with a sliding scale of eligibility, the families that are going to receive the most dollars from the program are going to be the families on the lower end of the income scale. Inherently, those are the ones who are probably in a lot of these lower performing districts. And so that narrative falls apart pretty quickly, that it's just wealthy people who are receiving these dollars.
And also, I mean, let's keep in mind, I have lots of very, very wealthy friends that the state pays for their kids to go to public school. That's not free either. So we don't really means test education in this country. And so enabling these dollars to flow to another school, I appreciate and want to continue the policy of making sure that the lowest income families have the resources they need to get a proper education wherever they choose. But if other Ohioans that are not poor want that opportunity, I think that's a great extension of our policy in funding public education in this country. We don't tell people where they should go to school.
But certain districts tell people where you can only go to school. I always thought that former Senate President Huffman, current Speaker Huffman, and I think you would agree as well, that you hear the mantra of, well, we're public schools, we have to take everybody. Well, no, you don't, because not every district does open enrollment, participates in open enrollment. So this is basically an open enrollment option if there is a school that's close to you, and some parents don't mind driving to get their kids to the school they want them to go to.
Yeah, it's all about choice. It's all about what's best for that family. And frankly, this is something that we should be more encouraging of, not less encouraging of. And really what the opposition argument is about, it's not about all the things that we've talked about where, somehow they need better supported this way, that way, or the other way. It's really they just want more money in the public school systems. We've put more money in the public school systems at a record rate, as has been talked about already, without an appreciable increase in outcomes. And so choice is essential, and choice will continue to be part of Ohio's policy.
Well, John, also, I think a lot of opponents of school choice are really just advocates for more money, like President McColley said. they keep talking about, well, like, oh, 90% of students are in public schools. Why are we sending this money over there? Well, that's not exactly true. Ohio has a lot of school choice options, including public school open enrollment. Only about 75%, it's actually probably a little less than that now, of Ohio students attend their locally assigned public school. There's 11% are in private schools. There's about 6 or 7% in charter schools. There's almost 100,000 students that are open enrolled in other public school districts. There's joint vocational school district options, and that's before you start getting into things like magnet schools that parents are able to choose that are obviously they're public schools, maybe part of their district, but they're not locally assigned. That is also a form of school choice. So anyway, I just think that's important. We've had a long history of school choice here, and obviously the Senate under President McColley's leadership and like you said before, in the past decade has continued to support those.
Here in Ohio, we like to say that we fund students, we fund pupils, not buildings. I mean, we really fund enrollment here, don't we? President McColley, is that the goal, or where do you see this going in the future?
Well, our education funding formula hasn't always been an adequate correlation to the amount of students in the building. We have what have been called caps and guarantees in our education funding formula, which has made it anything but a formula at the end of the day, because my understanding is that there's probably over 70%, maybe you know the number, Yitz, of school districts who are either at the cap or guarantee, or were at least before we revised the formula a few years ago, which basically means they were in a constantly moving upward channel of funding without being at the actual formula output for the amount of money that they would be receiving. And so it's something where, and we saw this reflected when the governor, when we put in place the fair school funding formula several years ago.
What a bad name.
Part of the promise of the program was that once implemented, it would eventually begin to chip away at the caps and guarantees and allow school districts to more accurately be funded based on their enrollment numbers, as opposed to being artificially raised or kept down by the guarantee on the floor end or the cap on the ceiling end. Instead, when the governor did a modest 5% phase out in the first year and a 10% phase out in the second year, that would have began to have these school districts more accurately funded based on their actual enrollment, the collective cry from the public school sectors in the state of Ohio was deafening. And they all collectively obviously forgot part of the agreement that was reached several years ago, that this day was coming through the implementation of the funding formula. And so naturally it appears that they've reverted back to the same argument that it will never be enough money. The money needs to constantly go up. And we need to have a serious public policy discussion about that, especially at a time when we're not necessarily getting better results on a wider basis from our public schools. Is what are we getting for our investment in this formula, and should the formula be altered to more accurately reflect the students who are in those buildings, as opposed to seeing in some cases over the last decade a 20% increase in funding, while at the same time in some districts seeing a 20% decrease for that same district in student population, which is resulting in very disparate results in how much we fund on a per pupil basis.
Yeah, not to mention the $10 billion cash carryover of the 5-year forecast. And you can see for yourself on the Department of Education and Workforce website under the 5-year forecast spreadsheets for all districts in the state of Ohio. It's amazing. Not every district, of course. Some of it's based on geography. But for example, Columbus Public Schools had more than a $320 million cash carryover and just passed a new school levy last year. So money doesn't always equal results, but at some level there has to be results, and the EdChoice Scholarship Program is getting results in some of those areas that need it the most. What would you like to see moving forward with the program?
Well, I mean, I would like to obviously, I think that the governor, when he introduced the budget, they actually did not propose any increase in EdChoice scholarship. It's obviously a tighter budget than usual, and in some ways that's okay. They have allocated I think they're projecting 15% enrollment growth in the program. So there is definitely money that's been allocated towards that. We would like to see increased funding for low-income voucher students. We think that they need more resources. We fund low-income students in public schools and charter schools. We think that low-income students in the voucher program should be able to do that as well. And we're working with a number of senators to maybe make that a reality. Who knows?
Well, we'll see as the budget process moves forward, but without a doubt, when the program was expanded, there was an overwhelming response from parents that if it wasn't a successful program, if it wasn't meaningful and didn't produce results, there wouldn't have been the avalanche of people that said, this is remarkable, we need to take advantage of this for our family.
Absolutely, and I think it's a reflection as well that of the acceptance of this type of policy on a broad basis to basically say, look, we're paying taxes to the state of Ohio too, and we're having our young children educated as well. It only makes sense that we be able to take some of our tax dollars and put them to the use that we think is best for our family. And so I think you're seeing that in the enrollment numbers. It's been a pretty big success, I believe, and hopefully it'll continue to grow.
Studies called The Effects of Ohio's EdChoice Voucher Program on College Enrollment and Graduation, produced by the Urban Institute. You can find that online. Ohio Senate President Rob McColley, appreciate your time. Rabbi Yitz Frank, always great to see you. Thank you for your time as well. And thanks for tuning in. We'll see you soon.